Okay, this is chapter 8, behavioral ecology. So we'll walk through a bit of mating and foraging behavior and how that relates to ecological structure. The key concepts of this chapter are evolution is the basis for adaptive behavior. Animals make behavioral choices that enhance their energy gain and reduce their risk of becoming prey. Mating behavior reflects the costs and benefits of parental investment in mate defense, and there are advantages and disadvantages to living in groups. The chapter starts off with this kind of interesting example where when you look at the structure of a lion pride, there's a dominant male who eventually gets taken out by a younger, more stronger, more more vital male. When that happens, then the new male in the pride may go and commit infanticide and kill the other cubs or kill cubs in that pride because it makes the females more receptive to mating, and therefore will allow the new male to sire more cubs before he's replaced by another younger male. So basically, as the lead lion in the pride, your time is limited, and the object is to sire as many offspring as possible, knowing that soon you will be removed from that pride, and you're trying to get as many offspring out as possible. So there's many seemingly odd behaviors that exist in the animal world. In many species, females are more choosy than males when selecting a mate. In some species, males are choosy and females try to mate with as many males as possible. We'll break that down, look at it. Kind of comes down to parental investment. And whoever's investing the most amount of energy in reproduction tends to be the choosier individual. We often kind of think of this as the other way around, but sometimes in the bird world, the larger, more colorful males, the males of the species are larger and more colorful. In this species, females fight over the right to mate with the males, and males choose the female which they want to mate with. You typically think of it as maybe the other way in birds, but there's some examples where females are competing for which male they're going to mate with. And the animal's behavioral decisions plays a critical role in obtaining food, finding mates, and avoiding predators. These decisions have costs and benefits that affect the individual's ability to survive and reproduce. And this is the basis of behavioral ecology, which is the study of the ecology and evolutionary basis of animal behavior. Animal behaviors can be explained at different levels. There's proximate and ultimate causes. And so proximate's the immediate to the how the behavior occurs, and the ultimate is the why the behavior occurs, the evolutionary and historical reasons. As behavioral ecologists, we try to focus on the ultimate causes, but the proximate's often the most visible. One example of that might be antler size. And so if you're thinking about antlered animals, we can use black-tailed deer, which are on campus as an example. Typically the male with the largest set of antlers has the better fitness, it breeds with more females compared to a male with a smaller set of antlers. And so the proximate cause we would think of as antler size, but the ultimate cause being that antler size is a representation of fitness. And so mate choice is based on selecting the most fit partner. The proximate is antler size. And a quick word about antlers. People often assume that you can count the age of a buck based on the number of tines or the size of the antlers. That's really only true for like 1, maybe 2-year-old individuals. So you have spikes and forkies. After that, a 3-year-old could throw a bigger set of antlers than a 5-year-old that really antler size is an indication of health of that year. So you could be a 5-year-old and maybe, have a tough time, not obtain a lot of food, and have a small antler size, where you can have a 3-year-old that's in a good area, has a lot of browse, has a lot of food, and they'll produce a much larger set of antlers compared to the 5-year-old. So antler size is typically what we think of selection being driven by. The ultimate cause is there's a presumed fitness and better genetics associated with the individual with a larger antler size. Natural selection should favor individuals whose behaviors make them efficient at foraging, getting mates, and avoiding predators. If the traits that confer advantage are heritable, natural selection can result in adaptive evolution. Traits that confer survival and reproductive advantages tend to increase in frequency over time. So whatever trait, whatever reason led to that animal being fitter, more energy, larger, in the case of mating systems, more decoration, birds, coloration, large antlers, things like that. If that is heritable, if there's something in their genetics that resulted in that, then those genes will be passed on at a higher frequency. If it's not, if it's purely environmental, then we wouldn't expect that to be inherited, but things that are based in genetics would be inherited. This is a kind of interesting example where they had two groups of cockroaches. One that they fed corn syrup to that had insecticide in it, and then a wild type that had not been exposed to insecticide-laden corn syrup. And what they're able to show is that the desire to consume corn syrup, or fructose, is heritable in cockroaches. And so the individuals that had the gene that said corn syrup good wound up all dying in the experiment. And so then the second and third generations would not eat the corn syrup, where the wild type would consume corn syrup. So it's the feeding index based on corn syrup. So the individuals that have gone through 1 or 2 generations of big selection, you eat corn syrup, you die immediately, would no longer eat corn syrup because that is a heritable trait. The genes associated with corn syrup being something desirable are in fact heritable in that population, which is kind of unique, I think, to have a corn syrup gene, but apparently it's true in cockroaches. And so through this mechanism, they can show that this is a selection pressure, right? If you eat corn syrup, you die. And that selection pressure is passed on, or that impact is passed on to future generations, meaning the offspring or the offspring of the offspring from individuals that went through the selection process still have a negative affinity towards corn syrup, even if they themselves had not been exposed to the insecticide-laden corn syrup. This is another kind of interesting study looking at 2 different types of mice that are closely related, an outfield mouse and a deer mouse. Deer mice have these little tiny tunnels with no escape route, where the old field mice will have longer tunnels and then an escape tunnel. So they took these 2 types of mice, crossbred them to see what their offspring would do, and then took those offspring and bred them back to the deer mouse. So we'll kind of go through that example here. So these 2 mice can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So and all of the F1 offspring, so F1 hybrid, so one parent's an old field mouse, the other parent's a deer mouse. I don't think it said, sometimes it matters which one's the male, which one's the female. I don't think they specified that here. So all the F1 hybrids built burrows with escape tunnels. So all of the F1s acted as the old field mice. So they had that genetic code from the old field mice to build an escape tunnel. But then when they took the F1 hybrids and made them back with deer mice, and so now they're, you could think of those being 25% Oldfield mice and 75% deer mice. About half of those would make an escape tunnel, and the other half didn't. So here's the deer mouse. None of them made escape tunnels. All of the Oldfield mice made escape tunnels. All of the F1 hybrids made escape tunnels. And then the back cross, which are the F1s and the deer mice, about half of those made escape tunnels. This is showing that they're 25% Oldfield mouse and 75% deer mouse. So showing that that desire to make an escape tunnel, that function of making an escape tunnel, is genetic. And individuals with an allele for a certain behavior may not always perform that behavior. They may change that behavior under different conditions. And so we can think about genotype and phenotypic plasticity is really what that's saying, is that they may have the genetic code for a behavior, but they might not need to invoke it unless there's a strong selection mechanism occurring, limited food, predators, things like that. But by assuming that genes affect behaviors, natural selection has molded them over time, and we can make specific predictions about how animals will behave. So basically, the genetic code is like the options that an organism can do, and then based on exposure, based on what's going on in their environment, different genes will be expressed. So they don't always do the same thing, but you have to take into consideration the other factors going on at the time. Food availability varies greatly over time and space. Some food items may be easier to get than others. I really like the optimal foraging theory. So the optimal foraging theory is that animals will maximize the amount of energy acquired per unit feeding time. This assumes that natural selection acts on foraging behavior of animals to maximize energy gain. We'll go into the optimal foraging theory here, but effectively it just says, if there's a whole bunch of food, you eat as much as you can and then quickly move to the next patch and do the same thing again. So you're maximizing the amount of energy per unit feeding time. And you can think about this as, feeding has a cost, both, exposure to predators, but also there's an energetic cost associated with feeding. So profitability of a food item depends on how much energy the animal gets relative to the amount of time it spends searching for and handling the food. Success increases with effort, but at some point, more effort results in no more benefit. The net energy obtained begins to decrease. Okay, the two words that we need to commit to memory here are gross and net. Gross, in the business world, gross is how much money you have at the end of the day if you're in your till, and net is what you net after you pay for expenses, after you pay for the products you put in your store, after you pay your employees, after you pay your rent, etc. So gross is the amount of money coming in. Net is the amount that ends up in your bank account at the end of the month. Plus H and S, handling and searching. So, an example like nuts or prey, there's a lot of handling that goes in. You can't just pick it up and put it in your mouth. You might have to crack a shell, or you might have to kill it. And then searching is the distance between those patches that have your desirable food. So we'll walk through the graph here. And so here we're going to look at total energy obtained. And you can see it starts to level off. There's an asymptote here where, the more time you spend, you're not going to gain any additional energy. Time invested is a linear graph. So, the more time you spend, the more time you spend. And then net energy gained. So after you take into consideration the time and energy it takes to in pursuit of getting food. And so here we're trying to optimize for this peak when net energy gained is maximum. And then as we fall below the cumulative energy investment, we're actually losing energy, or we're getting a much smaller net energy return. So typically, you want to optimize here. Typically, when you hit here, you'll start to move and try to find a new patch. So it's a way of just thinking about how animals move around. We'll go through a couple examples here. Optimal foraging models can be tested in field and lab. If foraging behavior is an adaptation to limited food supplies, then we must be able to relate the benefit of the behavior to survival and reproduction. So we have to have a mechanism, is really what it's saying, is that we have to have a mechanism between this relationship between time searching, handling food, energy obtained, and how animals make a choice based on that. Using an optimal diet selection model in a study of great tits, the prey size, profitability, and time needed to capture and consume the prey handling time was varied. Birds consumed an increasing percentage of large mealworms as the relative profitability of those larger prey items increased, as the model predicted. So this is the conveyor study, conveyor belt study. Pull that page up here. I guess I can't pull that page up, but let me see here. It was pretty interesting. Yeah, the oyster catchers, the other ones. This is the pike, crabs. Yeah. So in this idea, the relative profitability of the prey. So this is number of large over number of small. So 4 would be, you would see 4 times as many large prey compared to small prey. So on the conveyor belt idea, it would be large prey, large prey, large prey, large prey, small prey, large prey, large prey, large prey, large prey, small prey. Here on the conveyor belt, it would be large, small, large, small, large, small. And large have a longer handling time. And so this is the selection of large prey. So when large prey are most dominant, the birds will hone in on those, which justifies the additional handling time, where if large prey are rare and small prey are more common, it becomes more advantageous to eat many small things because you can handle them quickly. So, because as you're handling it, things are going by. And so if you're just focusing on large prey, you might eat a large prey and then you have to wait, and then grab a large prey and eat it. Where in that time that you're handling the large prey and waiting for another large prey to come by, you might have passed on like 10 small prey. Where if you just switched and were just focusing on the small prey, you could get more calories. Where if large prey are just out there everywhere, you can eat one, when you finish, there's another one, and you can eat it. There's no wait time in between. The availability of large prey is abundant enough where the search time is minimized. And so what this is really doing is like changing the amount of search time that's required. So it's kind of interesting to think about. I like conveyor belt analogies as well, like hot dogs and hamburgers, things like that, of a way of thinking of feeding behavior. This oyster catcher one is interesting as well. These are Eurasian oyster catchers. We have an oyster catcher species here. Our oyster catchers tend to eat rocky tidal invertebrates, limpets, things like that. And so they were looking at, they show the birds select prey items based on a specific size range. That small bivalves don't provide enough energy to offset the energy needed to find and open them. And the largest bivalves are too difficult to open. So what this is pushing towards is what I call the Goldilocks. Well, I don't call it the Goldilocks hypothesis, but what is legitimately referred to as the Goldilocks hypothesis. It's a real thing, and I like it, so I mention it a lot. Is that, some are too small, some are too big, and some are just right. And so here, a large bivalve might, give you more energy, but you can't get into the darn thing, and small ones aren't really that beneficial. The optimal foraging theory can also be applied to other things as well, looking at historic diet consumption. There's archaeological periods in Southern California where one of my study clams, Donax, I should grab some, Donax, these little tiny guys, were most abundant in the archaeological record, and initially people thought, well, this must have been like a famine situation because people are investing all this energy to get these little tiny clams. But when you actually do the math on it, when these clams are abundant, the whole beach is just covered in them. I mean, you could obtain, hundreds of pounds of them per hour with almost no effort. And so, it following the optimal foraging theory, you would switch to a small prey because they were just so abundant that they were easy to get. And so we have to kind of take into consideration availability as well as just overall size. Where initially people looked at the archaeological record and said, okay, people were consuming small clams during this period, so it must have been out of necessity. But when you look at it with an optimal foraging theory lens, you can obtain a lot of calories very quickly by targeting a small species when they're hyper abundant and relatively easy to cook. You just steam them and they all pop open. They're more like eating popcorn. And there's some theories around that with killer whales as well, switching from stellar sea lions to otters. Estes' work, where in Alaska, the marine mammal eating orca whales tend to want to eat stellar sea lions or something large. As those decline, they switch to sea otters, which he equates to eating popcorn because they're small and don't have a whole lot of nutrition per unit size, and so they have to eat a whole bunch more sea otters, which then declines sea otter populations, which increases sea urchin populations, which declines kelp forest. And so there's this big kind of interaction there. The marginal value theorem. So this is, to me, kind of in conjunction with optimal foraging hypothesis. This is just saying how long you would stay in a patch, and when you would give up on that patch and move to another patch. And it has to do with both the amount of food within a patch and then the distance to the next patch, because moving costs energy, and it also opens you up to potentially predation as well. So we can look, this graph looks a little funky at first, but we'll kind of walk through it here. So the first thing we want to look at is this cumulative energy gain. And so here, as it levels off, there's no more energy gain. So based on you can think of time here on the X and energy gain on the Y. So you could hang out in a patch all day or for multiple days, and you're not going to get any more energy. You're going to consume most of the energy within that patch will be consumed, and there's no additional benefit for being there. The time at which you decide to move to the next patch is dependent on how far that is. And so if we'll start with the short patches, and so trying to think of a good example. I don't know, clumps of grass. If you're a deer and you're in a mixed woodland area where there's open fields, you'll browse in a small patch. If the next patch isn't that far away, you're going to capitalize on this early part of the graph that for every unit of time you're there, you get a massive amount of energy. And the vegetation is browsed down to a lower level to where you can keep browsing it. You ate all the nutritious protein, kind of nutritious parts of the grass, maybe the seeds, and now you're getting down to kind of the stubble. So the first couple bites are the most nutritious. You're getting all the good stuff, and then you can keep working until you keep chewing that grass down to the soil, or there's another patch just right over there. So just browse off all the good stuff and move to the next one. Now, if the next patch is really far away, it's going to take you a lot of time to get there. So you might want to exploit all of the resources in your patch further. So instead of just cropping the top off the grass, you might chew it down to near soil level. In that case, you're writing this graph of energy gain versus time to a later point where you're getting per unit time less energy return, but there's a big cost to move to the next patch. I just have another good example, and I just lost it. Grass. What was the other thing I was thinking of? Oh, shoot. Time between patches. Low-hanging fruit, effectively, is what it's saying. So if you the same thing's true actually for deer and apple orchards too. They'll come in and eat all the low hanging fruit, and then later they might stand up and try to eat some of the higher fruit. What was the other one? Not seeds. Oh man, a good example popped in my head and I lost it. Oh, bears and salmon. When salmon are abundant, bears will catch salmon, spawning salmon in rivers, and for females they'll just bite the belly, which is all the eggs, and then they'll discard the rest of the fish. Or when salmon are abundant, they'll just eat the hump off the male, which is all fatty, and then discard the rest of the salmon. So when there's lots and lots of salmon, bears don't eat the whole thing. They just eat the fatty part, toss it, and grab another one. When salmon are less abundant, they might eat the entire salmon. So that's kind of an example of both optimal foraging theory, but also the marginal value theorem. And so in that case, you can just grab a fish, eat the most nutritious part, toss the rest, go on to the next one, because there's a bunch of additional fish, a bunch of salmon in the stream. When salmon become rare and it's harder to catch them, then you might invest the time to eat all of the salmon. And so you can think of this short part here as the eggs of a female, not one or two bites, tons of fat, tons of energy. Eating the rest of it takes more time and you get marginal amounts of energy from it. But if there's no other fish to catch, you're going to eat the whole thing. If there's a river full of fish, you're going to bite the belly off, eat the eggs, toss the rest, and keep going. Let's see, let me make it through. The next couple slides here. And so the longer travel time between food patches, the longer the animal should stay in a patch. Cowie tested this. Again, with great hits. The travel time between food patches was manipulated by some food cups that resulted in predictions that matched the theorem. And so this is this kind of lab study where they had hidden food and sticks and things like this. And here, the travel time between patches was directly related to the time spent at patches. So the further apart patches are, the longer the birds would stay there and feed. When there's a whole bunch of patches really close, they would just kind of bounce from patch to patch, kind of take the first little bits, all the good stuff, and then move on from there. And the optimal foraging theory does not apply to animals, as well to animals that eat mobile prey. And so if you're if you're a predator chasing down prey, it might not work as well compared to when you're really the patch dynamics are thinking about, you can be carnivores as well, but typically consuming prey that aren't going to run away from you. And the assumption is that energy is in short supply, and this dictates the foraging behavior, and it may not hold up well. Resources other than energy can be important, such as nitrogen and sodium. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then I'll pick it back up here.